Foucault's Discipline and Punish acknowledges the use and acceptance of public tortures and executions that depended on certain external cultural and demographic conditions, which produced a particular historical attitude towards the body. So, the low cost of labor power, the Christian contempt for the body, and the high mortality rate helped to make death familiar and gave rise to rituals that taught people to cope with it. But also, simultaneously, there were certain uprisings, the threat of civil war, the rise of the parliaments, the political symbolism, and the real force displayed at the scaffold made it a central prop of the sovereign power. But the book moves on to a critique of the 18th century system of criminal justice. So Foucault describes that these executions were sometimes degenerative and these degenerated into a disorderly scene. So instead of bearing a respectful witness, the crowds came to mock the authorities and to transform the condemned man into a popular hero. Uh, This requires a special mention. Now, why did this happen? Because despite the brutal punishment that was given to the condemned man, the man survived, and this was taken as a grace of God. So that person was transformed into a popular hero. So this tendency apparently became more pronounced towards the end of the century. So when more and more people who were a part of that crowd revolted against what it saw to be injustice, class law, or the execution of one of its own. So the result of these disorders, Foucault claims, was to bring out on the part of the state power a political fear of the effects of these ambiguous rituals. Hence, Foucault turns to the critiques of the criminal justice that emerged in those times, whether these were the pamphlets, tracts, petitions, which were produced in the period which was prior to the revolution in France. So the terms or the proclaimed principles of humanity and the rights of man, the principles that were to extend even to the wretched criminal in order to bring a measure of leniency and restraint to the penal law was something, that was introduced post the 18th century. So Foucault and several other historians of the period, they have tried understanding this real force that mobilizes a movement of reform, whether you call it a philosophical system or a human concern for the fate of others. And here, the other is a criminal. So it was rather the lower and more familiar principle of self interest that led to a recognition of political exigency and the need for an appropriate change. So the period was marked by a predominant pattern of the criminal behavior, which was more property oriented and professionalized. And it was also threatening at the same time. Why? Because there was a growth of ports, warehouses, large workshops, which put more and more movable property at risk. So the development of a capitalist economy also brought some new and strict attitudes toward the non-observance of law on the part of the rising middle classes. This was marked by various illegalities, which include tax and rent avoidance, smuggling, poaching, gleaning, and this was so widespread and it was accepted in the landed economy of the ancient regime. Now, because this took to a less tolerable appearance of the property violations. The irregular terrorism of 18th century criminal justice, with its multiplicity of courts, its competing jurisdictions, its lack of systematic police, innumerable loopholes was utterly ineffective. So the critics demanded for a more rational and a more certain system of justice. So it was based on an extensive and detailed policing, a uniform and a systematic penal procedure, and the punishments were carefully moderated to fit the crime. So this was a transformation now whereon the shift would be from the condemned body to the soul, to the reforming of the soul, and hence the penal reforms. So what was expected was neither leniency nor too much of excess or severity. So instead, what was required was a certainty and comprehensiveness of the application of the laws, which would operate as to fit the finest grain of the social body. So there was a need to design a framework to deter the incipient criminality of the lower classes in a new and efficient manner. At the same hand, there was also a dire need to limit the arbitrary power of the sovereign. So, several criminal law reforms swept Europe during the 19th century. Discipline and Punish is written against this background of political change and criminal law reform. Particular penal reforms were proposed by Beccaria and the ideologues in the late 18th century. These reformers advocated what Foucault calls in this book, and there is a chapter in one of the sections, the gentle way in punishment. So the whole system of sanctions was starkly opposed to the excesses of the ancient regime. I already explained in the previous lectures that there was a contrast between the classical age and the modern system, which was now progressing towards a movement of reforms. And this reformation led to the birth of the prison. So they declared that the punishment must not be arbitrary, the capricious expression of a sovereign's will should be a reflection of the crime and it should not be a reflection of his violence. So the kind of punishment that was to be meted out to a criminal was to be in full commensuration with the kind of crime that a person had committed. So the reformers insisted that the punishments and their implicit messages should be publicly displayed because punishment was an example to everyone that this particular criminal act is not to be repeated. It has to be a deterrent. But the punishment also, was still aiming to influence others because it addressed to the calculating, reasoning mind of the citizen and not to the trembling bodies of the cowed onlookers. So a matter of gentle didactism and not of terror was the concern while these reforms were to take place. So punishment, therefore, became like a lesson, a sign, a representation of public morality, which was openly displayed to all. So in the penalty, rather than seeing the presence of the sovereign, one should read the laws themselves. For all this to happen, whatever has been studied by Foucault is a whole repertory of the public punishments, that were taking place. He reflects on different crimes, and he also reflects on the reversal of the interests and also of the attitude of the public towards the spectacle of the condemned man. So what was outlined by the reformers was a system of imprisonment in which the prison became the standard sanction for virtually the whole range of offenses. Foucault makes it clear that the journalized use of the prison, with its characteristic secrecy, isolation, and monotony, was largely at odds with the theories of the reformers. So, again, it was realized that some kind of development had to take place. So, imprisonment had only a limited and a marginal position within most of the penal systems, functioning merely as a place to secure offenders awaiting trial or punishment rather than as a penalty in itself. So, henceforth, the disciplinary origins of the prison took place. The rise of the prison points to the prior existence of several great models of punitive confinement, which include the Walnut Street prison in Philadelphia, a few practices that were carried out in the Gloucester or in Amsterdam. These institutions emphasized on work and reformation and had developed regimes which to some extent converged with the reformers' programs. They were correctionalist rather than punitive in design. So what both the programs aimed to reform the individual, and also while reforming the individual or making these corrections through a punitive design, different technology to get hold of the individual and to transform him were adopted. So each developing specific technique that addressed the body, and it gained an access to the soul. The reformers approached the matter at the level of ideas, proposing signs, lessons, representations as forms of persuasion or aids to calculation. Contrastingly, the prison, seizes the body of the inmate, exercising certain controls, trains it, organizes it from time to time, determines its movement in order to ultimately transform the soul, that is the seat of the habits. And habits, because of the wrong habits, the person is in the prison. So it takes hold of the individual, manipulates him, molds him, and this is a behavioristic modeling and remodeling of the condemned body, rather than just attempting to influence his moral thinking from the outside. So there is a major difference between the reformers' model and the one that came established, a difference that is primarily because of the technological things or techniques than the legal or theoretical things. So the text Discipline and Punish undergoes a sudden and rather disconcerting shift of focus, moving away from the penal ideas and legal theory to examine a much wider, non discursive series of developments, that is what Foucault calls the disciplinary techniques. So, after having stated in part one the condition of the condemned man and the conditions of the classical times, in part two, Foucault speaks about or writes about or tries to understand and gauge the kind of practices which move towards a journalized form of punishment. Also, not to forget that those were the times when the punishment for different crimes was almost same, and this gave rise to a lot of resentment in the public, because a person stealing, say, a loaf of bread or for any kind of petty theft was also given the same punishment as the one who had murdered someone. Also, keep in mind, those were the times when the punishment given to a murderer belonging to a higher class was different than what was given to a person belonging to a lower class had he murdered someone. So these were certain things, which had to be set in order. So Foucault's text, Discipline and Punish, it maps a trajectory of all those times, and it moves on to the understanding of the disciplinary techniques. So when he moves to these disciplinary techniques, they turn out to be the most original and interesting aspect of Foucault's historical argument. So the conventional accounts of penal history, the revisionist accounts of Rotham and other theorists take a central place to the ideological genesis of modern punishment. And there were several ideas and intellectual movements that developed in the course of time. Foucault shifts attention to the role of political technology in the penal development, and he tries to understand the political significance, and also he adopts a more structuralist approach to map out the techniques and principles of the disciplinary power. So whatever he tries to understand through this structural mode can be put on a few parameters, namely training of the body, normalizing the deviance, Bentham's panopticon, discipline and democracy, and finally the discovery of criminal and criminology. While speaking about the training of the body, Foucault says that discipline is an art of the human body, and its mastery it comes over some time, and discipline has a very long history. So in the classical age, the body came to be conceived as an object and target of power that could be controlled and improved without the costly use of violence. The techniques provided the means of control and improvement were through a variety of institutions. And those institutions were the institutions like the army, the monasteries, the schools, hospitals, and workshops. So Foucault sets out a kind of blueprint of the methods and the principles of discipline, abstracting these from the practices and the texts of the period. And you very well know, studies the 18th and the 19th century. So discipline, all in all, was a political anatomy of a detail which operated on the smallest scale of control. So Foucault is very particular about paying attention not only to the whole body, but also to its individual movements and gestures. So discipline, or the training of the body that Foucault talks about in this book, aimed to increase the efficiency of each movement and development of some kind of coordination with others, exercising different forces and building them up together. So this brings a constant, uninterrupted supervision that is alerted at the very slightest deviation, which means that there is a meticulous control of the body that is being disciplined. And to facilitate this kind of control, organizational principles are put in place, and whether they suit someone or not, these are to be followed. So the army did the most in this kind of development of the art of distributing individuals in a space. Its ranks and files were introduced to a set orderliness into a mass of individuals, separating them one by one so that they could be individually viewed, supervised, and assessed. The same thing happened whether in making such distributions, whether it was a schoolroom, a workshop, or a hospital. Similarly, even the monasteries developed a timetable, a means of imposing set rhythms that organize time and movement, specifying a series of occupations and regulating the cycle of repetition. On a smaller scale, the concept of the maneuver derives from both the barracks and the workshops. So, the repeated routine, the exact posture of the body, the positioning of the limbs, the smallest of bodily movements were programmed to increase their efficiency and linked them to the use of a weapon or the operation of a machine. So, by all these means, the bodies were put through their paces until they became docile, efficient, useful machines that carried out the functions to which they had been trained. So, such was the influence of training the bodies through control and reaching to a point when they become so conditioned and docile. The next parameter that Foucault focuses on is normalizing the deviance. So he says individuals are by nature recalcitrant. And so dealing with disobedience is a central problem for any method of control. So the disciplinary methods did not simply punish their troublesome cases, but also developed a whole new method of sanctioning, which is labeled as normalization. So this method is essentially corrective rather than punitive in orientation and concerned the main concern of normalization is to induce conformity rather than to exact retribution or expiation. So by all means, the assessment of the individual was to be done in relation to a desired standard of conduct. And already I have explained in one of the introductory videos, that the human sciences set standard for normalization, and any behavior was assessed in comparison according to those standards. So anyone who was behaving against that, would be labeled as a transgression or a deviant behavior. So the surveillance arrangements and examination procedures further provided some knowledge which allowed, if at all there were incidents of non-conformity or departures from the set standards that were recognized and put into force. Since the object was to correct rather than punish, the actual sanctions used tend to involve exercises, training, and certain measures that in themselves help bring conduct into the line. Examination, and yes, that is a word we all are very familiar with. The examination system was also a central method of control, which allowed a close observation, whether differentiation or assessment of the standards, and the identification of failure to conform. So a record or that allowed the characteristics of individuals to be assessed over time and be compared with others was placed under the framework of an examination. So from this time onwards, what started happening was writing about the individual ceased to be a form of worship, was fit only for the notables, kings, heroes, and instead, what was coming into form was a domination to which the powerless were more and more subjected. So out of all these practices, whether it was through training or normalizing, emerges a detailed and systematic knowledge of individuals, a knowledge that gave rise in turn to various human sciences of criminology, psychology, sociology, and various other disciplines. So Foucault is at pains to point out the procedures of observation, examination, and measurement that allow this knowledge to develop, and at the same time, they become exercises of power and control over the individuals. Why? Because they are within the gaze of a selected few. The third parameter that he talks about is Bentham's panopticon. The panopticon, or the inspection house, which Jeremy Bentham designed in 1791, is the very epitome of the power knowledge principles. So it is a form of a circular building with individual cells around its perimeter, where windows and lighting were arranged so as to make their occupants clearly visible to the central inspection tower, though it remained opaque to them. So this kind of an architectural form designed to render individuals constantly subject to the knowledge and power of the central authorities was something, which was gaining prominence. So this constant visibility and vulnerability induces self-control on the part of the inmates of the cell. So what will happen if probably they know that they're being watched, they will behave in a normal manner. So power no longer required any kind of unleashing of the sanctions or imposing certain violent forms on the condemned man. So instead, its objects, it took a role or a framework whereby it could design and the behavior of the desired behavior of the criminal. So any remnant part of the physical repression gradually was replaced by a gentle and effective structure of domination. So in place of the violent, brutal, repressive forms of punishment came a gentle method, but this gentle method was also characterized by so much so of domination. Moreover, the power relations that were involved were quite automated and objective, and were an effect of the distribution of places and visibility, and did not depend on the strength or the intentions of those who occupy these positions. So according to Foucault, the usefulness of these panoptic disciplinary principles was such that they were soon imitated in society's major institutions and eventually came to be journalized through the entire social body. Now, what happened was precisely the journalized panopticism emerged, and this was a disciplinary principle which took place in the modern society, or created a disciplinary society or a society of surveillance in which everyone was subjected to infinite examination in the panoptic machine. The fourth parameter that he talks about is discipline and democracy. He says whatever the exact extent of the large claims, a number of points have to be clearly made regarding the genesis of discipline and the subsequent after effects. Although it was within the context of the early European capitalism that the disciplines achieved their rapid development, and the techniques and principles were transferable, may be operated elsewhere to continue with the power techniques. However, there was a special and interesting relationship to the development of democracy in the West, which is summed up by Foucault in his statement that the Enlightenment, which discovered the liberties, also invented the disciplines. So Foucault talks about the journalization of discipline that underpinned and made possible the journalization of the democratic constitutions and the expansion of the liberal forms of freedom. So without the vast infrastructure of power relations that subjected the masses to an orderly, disciplined existence, the extension of freedom could never have taken place. So in a way, he suggests, and I've already spoken about this in the earlier videos, that this kind of design also gives rise to resistance. earlier not available. Prison practices of isolation, observation, and individual assessment ensured that the offenders no longer thought of in the abstract, but they instead were studied as individuals with their own characteristics, peculiarities, and differences. So, whereas the laws viewed the offender as being no different from anyone else, he happened to have committed an offense. The prison aimed to individualize the offender to find out what kind of person he was, to determine the relationship between his character and his criminality. So the prison led to the discovery of the delinquent, of the criminal type whose biography, character, and environment mark him off as a different from the non-delinquent, and that is how a deviance from the normalization, which I have already discussed. So this is how he traces the rise of the science of criminology, which takes up the task of investigating this criminal entity and describes it in all its aspects. This delinquent and criminology, further, Foucault makes a point, is of major importance because he argues that prisons did not discover the delinquent, but rather it fabricated him, and it did so in two distinct senses. First of all, it made the delinquents in a literal sense by creating the conditions. Offenders were so stigmatized and demoralized and de-skilled in prison that after their release, they tended to re-offend, to be reconvicted, and eventually transformed into career criminals. Second, the prison produced a delinquent in the categorical or epistemological sense by creating in the course of its practices the category of the individual criminal. It was in the prison that the individual criminal first became visible, isolated object of intense study and control. So these are certain implications of criminology or the systematic knowledge of the delinquent that is suggested by and developed within the prison system.